I'm Marianne Taylor, aka the House Detective, and as always in this episode I'm going to take you through some of the interesting finds I've made whilst researching houses in the last couple of weeks. Coming up in this episode, I'm going to tell you about some houses that were actually funded by the Golden Casket Lottery. It's a very interesting story. Next up, I'm going to tell you about some very cool middle names that I uncovered in the State Archives. Then I'll be talking about the many names that Annerley had. Next up, I'll share some great house history research resources. And finally, I'm going to take you through part one of the history of a house that I researched in Fortitude Valley. I hope you enjoy watching. The Golden Casket Lottery. Well, I mentioned in the last episode the Anzac cottages, which were a number of houses that were built under a charitable scheme. Didn't this just open up a Pandora's box of research leads to follow? And one of these was the Golden Casket's role in funding these cottages. So the Anzac cottages were part of an initiative introduced by the Queensland War Council, which I think is the coolest name for an organisation. I picture them, sitting around a big map desk in an underground bunker somewhere. Probably wasn't that cool. But they had established the Anzac Committee, which was a subcommittee of the War Council, and this committee aimed to provide housing and raise money basically to support the war effort. So the Anzac cottages, as I mentioned in the last video, were designed to house the widows and children of servicemen who had lost their lives during the First World War. The chairman of the Anzac Committee, who was John Coyne, who was known as Harry, he came up with the initiative of using the Golden Casket Lottery to fund construction of these homes. Later on, the scheme actually extended to build houses for servicemen who returned from overseas suffering from tuberculosis, which is a lung disease caused by a bacteria. TB stands for tuberculosis, and these were nicknamed TB cottages. This Queensland War Council and the Anzac Committee, they actually arranged for 3 draws of the Golden Casket Lottery, which was a Queensland-based lottery, to be run in order to fund the construction of these cottages. The first Golden Casket Lottery was held in 1917, and then the 3rd, 4th and 5th lottery were used to raise funds for constructing these houses. The first Anzac cottage was built in 1917, and then the scheme gradually wound down in the late 1920s. Overall though, 52 Anzac cottages and 26 tuberculosis cottages were built throughout Queensland, so it's quite an astounding scheme. If you want to learn more about it, there's a fantastic paper by Dr. Carmel Black, and I'll put a link in the description because it goes into it in some detail, and it's absolutely fascinating scheme. It's amazing, and a number of these cottages are on the Brisbane City Council Heritage Register, and one is actually on the State Heritage Register as well. So at least some of them are still protected, although many have been lost and a lot of them have been altered. In the last episode, I discussed the apprenticeship files that were held at Queensland State Archives. Now, I kind of accidentally stumbled across these in a different way when I was researching the Anzac cottages that I've just mentioned. When I typed in Anzac into the State Archives search, it popped up with a number of people who had Anzac in their name. Isn't that just the coolest middle name to have? So a lot of the files that popped up were actually apprenticeship files. I discussed in the last video that if you were an apprentice in Queensland between a particular time period, then the records of your indenture are held at the State Archives. And there was 5 gentlemen who had apprenticeship files at the State Archives who had Anzac as their middle name. Isn't that amazing? What a great middle name to have. And of course, I was looking at the dates and I thought, surely they had to have been born during the First World War. So of course I couldn't help myself, and I jumped on Ancestry and did a quick search for each of them and found their dates of birth. All 5 of these men were born during the First World War, and this is when the term Anzac began to be used to refer to Australian and New Zealand troops, particularly after the horrendous battle on the Gallipoli Peninsula. So we had Mervyn Anzac Greddon. He was born on the 11th of May 1916. Then there was Clarence Anzac Wire. He was born on the 15th of August 1917. Francis, known as Frank Anzac Barford. He was born on the 5th of January 1916. And then the day after Anzac Day in 1917, or what would become Anzac Day, Donald Campbell Brodie was born. So he was born on the 26th of April 1917. And finally, Arthur Anzac Jasper Harvey was born on what would become Anzac Day on the 25th of April 1916. Obviously there was quite a few patriotic families during the First World War, not surprisingly. I then actually got to wondering whether or not all of their fathers were actually serving during the First World War, and I'm still a bit curious about that, but I couldn't really justify taking any more time to look into it out of my own interest. But if any of you want to search those names and find out if their fathers served, comment below. I'd love to know whether or not that's the case. Interestingly too, 3 of those 5 gentlemen went on to serve in the Second World War as well. A little while ago, I researched this amazing Federation style home at Annerley. And as part of researching each house, I also like to look at the background history of the suburb to give a bit of a context to the house. So I look at when the land was first sold by the Queensland government, when it was subdivided further, what the main roads were through the area, and what some of the first establishments were in the vicinity. Now, Thomas Blackett Stevens, who is a name I come across all the time, he's just one of those rich white guys who owned a ton of land around Brisbane. He was the major landholder in this area, and he actually eventually gave his names to the Stephen Shire, which was the municipal board that managed that area before Brisbane City Council was formed. He actually ran a wool scour, which is a facility for washing sheep's wool. And he also had a tannery and fellmongery there, and that is a facility for converting animal hides into leather. And it was called the Eckerburn Wool Scour. So that name eventually began to be associated with the surrounding area, and it is now still used, but it's actually a locality rather than a suburb. But if you're wondering where the name Eckerburn came from, that's where it came from. The main settlement in this area, though, apart from the wool scour, began to be established around where what was Boggo Road, now Annerley Road, joins with Ipswich Road. Now, this was a major arterial to and from Brisbane and Ipswich, and to and from Brisbane and Beaudesert. So it was a very busy thoroughfare, and of course a pub was one of the first things to be established there to offer refreshments to these travellers. This pub was located in the V that is formed by the junction of today's Annerley and Ipswich roads, and not surprisingly, it was called the Junction Hotel. And even more amazingly, there's still a pub on the site, and it is still called the Junction Hotel, although it has previously been known by other names. This hotel was first licensed in 1866, and gradually a bit of a settlement started to spring up around it as well. Now, there was a post office established there eventually, and it was known as the Boggo Post Office. So I've talked about the history of Boggo and Boggo Road in previous interviews, but Boggo was generally a big area that stretched from today's Annerley almost out to Rockley in some cases. So it wasn't a really well defined area, and this area was generally known as Boggo as well, or parts of it as Eckerburn, as I mentioned. Eventually, however, it became known just as the Junction. And it was also sometimes referred to, the settlement was also sometimes referred to as Ipswich Road. In the 1880s, a big residential subdivision was created in the vicinity, and this was christened the Thompson Estate. So if any of you catch the 120 bus from Mount Gravatt into the city, there is actually still a bus stop on that route called the Thompson Estate. But this was a huge residential estate, and as part of this, they also constructed the Thompson Estate Provisional School. This later became the Thompson Estate State School, but then as the area became known as the Junction, another residential estate nearby was called the Junction Park Estate. So the school was then renamed Junction Park State School. So that name continues to this day and is a reminder of this early history of the Annerley area. Anyway, back to the naming of the settlement. As I mentioned, the post office was known as Boggo, but I think as the area developed and more people settled there, they probably needed to define the area and give the suburb a name. So what happened was that the post office name was the first thing to change. It was renamed Annerley in 1892. This name appears to have been chosen by the Postal Department, and its actual source isn't really known, but it may have been named after the area in London. Gradually, the name Annerley began to be used to refer to the area around the post office, and then eventually that was adopted as the official suburb name. So that's how Annerley came to have its name. As I mentioned, Junction Park State School survives as a reminder of this early name of the suburb, and there's also a Junction Terrace that runs off Ipswich Road. Next up, I thought I would share with you one of the most useful resources to uncover when your house was built, if it was built in the 1920s, 1930s or 1940s. What I'm talking about are the building application registers and the building application register indexes. They're held at the Brisbane City Council archives, which are located at Maruka, and it is a fabulous repository of historical information connected to Brisbane City Council. This includes building records. So although what survives is a bit hit and miss, there are a number of resources that I use there all the time for researching houses. The building application records that I want to talk about today are essentially early forms of development application records. So when I say register, I mean like a physical book register, big thick book, you kind of, open it. And these were recording any kind of building work that was applied to the council to undertake on people's property. They eventually, from about 1945, turned into building cards, which is another resource they have at the archives. But these ones are slightly earlier. For most of Brisbane, they date from about 1925 until 1945. For the inner city suburbs, there are some much earlier ones, 1909 to 1914. But as I said, it's a bit patchy, the coverage, so you'll definitely have to check if what you're looking for is there. So there's two different building application resources. One is I'm just going to say BAR for building application registers because it's too much of a mouthful to keep saying that. So the BAR indexes and the BARs themselves. Now the indexes they were only ever designed to be a way of finding records in the actual registers themselves, as a quick way of doing that. Unfortunately, the indexes are sometimes all that survives these days. Their correlating register doesn't survive, but so they still can provide a little bit of information and dates on when a house was built. The indexes contain the street that the house the proposed work was to be undertaken on, and the name of the applicant. So it's useful in that you can estimate if it says new dwelling. You can assume that the house was probably built around that time if it was approved. So it's a good indicator in combination with other information when your house was built. Now the building application registers themselves contain far more information, as you would expect. So they contain not only the street address, but the actual old property description. So before lot on plans, it was a series of subsequent re-subdivisions and divisions. So it would be something like re-subdivision 6 of subdivision 5 of re-subdivision 2 of subdivision A of portion 360. And as they got further and further subdivided, you tacked on more subdivisions and re-subdivisions. So you can see why we moved to the lot on plan concept. That's a much easier way to describe land. But these have those unique addresses. So if you have bought the old titles for your land, you can use the old land description off that to find it in this. You'll find out who owned the land, who the applicant was, sometimes who the builder was, and sometimes, if you're lucky and it's a grand house, who the architect was will be listed as well. It also also includes whether it was what the work was for. So you want to look for new dwelling if you're looking for when your house was built. And it also will have the cost of the house, which will give you some inclination of how grand it was as well. So they're very useful pieces of information. But word of warning, it's best to basically use the registers, particularly the ones that don't have indexes, as an absolute last resort to find the date of construction for your house. Now, the reason I say this is you don't want to go looking through hundreds of pages of PDF documents if you don't know for sure roughly when your house was built. So if you don't want to start with these and work from 1925 all the way to 1945 if you've got no idea when your house was built. You want to have narrowed down your date of construction to within a couple of years, and then you just want to search for those years in the building application registers. One of these, for example, is a 600-page PDF that is not indexed. So that takes me quite a long time to search for, and I have used it as a last resort a couple of times, and there is nothing more disheartening than scrolling through 600 pages and then not finding the house you're looking for. Very frustrating. I am currently actually paying someone to transcribe those though, to make it a bit quicker and easier, and I'll share that with the archives when it's completed so that everyone can benefit from it. But they are an incredible piece of information that can help you put together the jigsaw puzzle of when your house was built. Some of you might remember, if you've been following my Facebook and Instagram pages, and if you don't, please do. I share all my adventures and the things I get up to and all my research in detail, much more detail than I go into in these videos. But a little while ago, I shared a photo of a fantastic shop on the corner of James Street and Arthur Streets in Fortitude Valley. So it was an old photo of this building, and then I shared what it looks like today. Amazingly, it's still there. Now, why I was looking for photos of this area of Fortitude Valley was that I was hired to research a house that was next door to this shop. And just in the edge of that photo, you just capture a little glimpse of the house that I was hired to research. You can just see the chimney, and it matches the chimney of the house that was there. I say was because in 2023, this house was relocated from Fortitude Valley to Moorooka. And this week I'm going to talk about the history of the house where it was built on James Street, and then in the next episode I'll tell you a little bit more about the land that it was moved to, because the owners of the house commissioned me to research both histories, both blocks of land, the history of both blocks of land, the history of both blocks of land, if that makes sense. So when I started to look into it, both the shop on the corner and the house next to it, as well as the next house along, were all built by a bootmaker called Michael Lyons, and they were all built in around 1897. Michael didn't live in these cottages or in the above the shop to start with, but he did rent them out to tenants. Eventually though, his sister, who had been widowed, Catherine Healy, and her daughters moved into one of the cottages. Over the next few years, there was a little bit of musical houses going on, so Michael actually lived at one of the houses while Catherine and her daughters lived in another, and then for a time Michael and a couple of the daughters were living in one, and Catherine and one of her daughters was living in the other. So they seem to have mixed and matched and swapped and changed a little bit. Michael and Catherine lived in these cottages for quite a number of years until both their deaths, and then Catherine's daughters subsequently inherited the house, and a couple of them lived there for a while, and eventually the house passed to their descendants, and they owned it right up until after 1980, possibly a lot longer than that. In November 2023, the current owners of the house had it relocated to a block of land at Moorooka. And in the next episode, I will discuss some of the background history of that block of land and the house that used to be on the site prior to this one and what happened to it. So stay tuned for that one. Well, that was this fortnight's top 5 interesting finds from my house history research. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you next time.